Okay, are we running, Jim?
Yes.
Okay, we are. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to look at your prophets. Today we have three. Short though they be, they are so important and so powerful in their message. We ask that you guide us and open our minds to understand them. Give us the insight to walk by what they say and to live according to your word. We ask all of this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Amen. All right, we are off. Number one, our illustration. It has one illustration for this week, and it has three parts to it, one for each of the three prophets we're looking at. The prophets that we're looking at are not listed in the order in which they are recorded in the Bible, but fortunately, they're all next to one another, though we have to pass by one to get to the other. Yes?
I kind of always assumed that the books were laid out chronologically, and yet they are not.
No, they're not.
Is there a reason why they're in this particular order?
I cannot answer that question, why they're in this order. I will give you some of the chronological dating of these books, and you can see they're all in the same era, though. You know, they're all in that pre-exilic, exilic, post-exilic time period. But Zephaniah is definitely the first one. So Zephaniah is the first illustration that we have with the flaming torch and the sword. There's a sword in one hand and a torch in the other hand. It's based off of a passage that's in the prophet of Zephaniah in the book that says that God will search Jerusalem for anyone that is trying to hide from him. He will hold a torch in one hand and a sword in the other hand. So that's why the illustration looks like that. It's also probably the way that a conquering army would search through a city. You realize that people would try to hide their wealth any place they could to keep it away from the invaders and the conquerors. And so a conqueror would search high and low through your house, going to all of those places where everybody hides their stuff, you know, like under the carpet or, you know, in a box behind a refrigerator or something like that. They knew exactly where to go, and they would search out very diligently after conquering a city to make sure that nobody hid something of value on them. And the Lord uses the same illustration to how he's going to search out the inhabitants of Jerusalem to destroy them. He will do so with that same intensity that a conquering army would search out any wealth that may be hidden that they want to plunder and take back home. He will search them out in that very same way to seek and to destroy the children of Israel. Oh, this did this again. This better come off. Okay. All right, good. Last week we weren't so lucky. All right, we're back to normal. So that's number one. The second illustration that we have is you see a lion that is shattered. And you see the symbol of an Assyrian king in that symbol. This is the book Nahum. Nahum is 3 chapters of the destruction and the fall of Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria. And the lion is there because the Assyrians were thought of as a devouring lion that would scour the entire area and would walk into these weak countries, totally destroy them, and literally drag their prey back to their den. And when we read about this in Nahum, it talks about the lion being destroyed and the prey that has been brought back being devoured, but the lion is going to be destroyed and nothing will be brought back, and everything that he has brought back is going to be taken and distributed to the conqueror who destroys Babylon. So we'll look at that passage when we shoot through Nahum, but the idea is that of a lion, and that is how Assyria was thought of. And down in the bottom, we have a picture of a prophet, and the prophet has kind of a, well, it doesn't really look like a questioning look on his face, but the question mark above him indicates that he has some questions. Obviously, that prophet is Habakkuk. And the prophet Habakkuk has, in the first chapter, 2 questions that he asks. The first question is, Lord, how come the wicked seem to get away with it? Okay? Which is a question we wonder why today. And then after the Lord says he's going to destroy these wicked people, these people of Jerusalem, he says, I'm going to do it with Babylon. And then he's got another question in his mind. Lord, how can you destroy people who are wicked with people who are even more wicked? It made no sense to him. And the answer is given in the book of Habakkuk. To me, out of all of the Old Testament prophets, I think Habakkuk is one of the finest examples of a message that is given, that is pertinent to us in our life today, and we're going to spend some time on that. But that's why it is like that. Now you see the eagle in the forefront. The eagle is representative of the Babylonians who are going to swoop down and destroy those wicked people in Jerusalem. That eagle is Babylon. So with that having been said, you have all 3 of them. Now, what we have is, I can put these up on a bigger board and go and put Zephaniah up here, but I will guarantee you that when I get to Nahum, I'm going to forget to go to the next one. So somebody remind me, hey, forward to Nahum, okay? All right. The other thing that we talked about was, Jim brought up the question about chronology. How come the books aren't in order? For instance, Paul wrote 13 letters in the New Testament. They're not in order in the way he wrote them. They are placed in a particular order, though, and it's the reason why they placed them in that order. Do any of you know why Paul's letters are arranged in the way that they are arranged? What determined their order? Okay? Of all of the ridiculous reasons, size, the length of the book. It started with the biggest one, Romans, and ends with the smallest one. And so it goes from big to smallest, okay? So when you want to know why are they arranged that way, we don't know. The Gospels are not arranged chronologically. Matthew was probably not the first Gospel written. I personally believe, and Pastor Stolarczyk would probably disagree with this because I heard him teach that he thought that Matthew was the first. I believe that Mark was the first. It doesn't matter who was first, second, or third. Okay, we would probably all agree that John was last, but we don't have them in an order. So it's really hard to try to figure out why things happen the way we have them happening. Some of the things that we looked at in the past, people said, well, how come we're not discussing Ruth when we shot right by Ruth? Well, Ruth is something that came at a much later date, at the time after King David had already been king, because it was written and said that she was a descendant of King David. So this class has a tendency to put things in chronological order. I'm not guaranteeing that everything you see in here is chronological. But if you take a look at what we begin with in Crossways and go all the way through, we're going to be close to chronologically being correct. All right? Good. Okay, now we're at Zephaniah, the first prophet. 3 chapters, of course. Habakkuk and Nahum had 3 chapters too. But we want to get a dating for these books. And of the 3 that we have today, Zephaniah would be the first of the 3. And the reason why we would put him the first of the 3 is because his ministry more than likely begins during the reign of Josiah. Remember Josiah? He was the first of these kings that we were interested in, Josiah and Jehoahaz, who reigned for 2 months. And we have nothing written about Jehoahaz. When Megiddo was, when Josiah was killed at Megiddo, Jehoahaz was placed on the throne. And the Egyptians, after having defeated, on their way back to Egypt, simply picked up Jehoahaz and took him with them. And they placed somebody else on the throne. So we have Josiah, which was the good king. He was the king that started the reform. We talked about him in Jeremiah because Jeremiah did not believe that Josiah was really into the reform and did superficial stuff, but not getting to the root of the problem. So Josiah is the king who is ruling when Zephaniah is written. And he was the first king of the last 5. So this is during the time of Josiah, and in all likelihood, Zephaniah is written before Josiah began his reform. Remember, he was the good king that began to throw out all of the paraphernalia from the temple that was related to the false gods and knocked down, he destroyed all of the worship sites where the Baal was worshipped. And he also took down all of the worship sites where the true God was worshipped throughout the land so that there would be no worship anywhere. And he established worship only at Jerusalem, fulfilling what?
One God, one place.
One God, one place, which was exactly the message, the entire message that was delivered in the book of Deuteronomy. So he's the one who really nailed that. And for this reason, some have looked at Josiah as being the best of the best. He was the best king that ever was because he's the only king who was able to achieve and accomplish what Deuteronomy wanted done. So, he's that king, and this book was written before he began his reform because what the prophet is railing against is the destruction that is going to come upon Jerusalem for all of the things that they were doing wrong. And those things that were happening that were wrong were the things that were going on before Josiah's reform. So thus we would date it at that time before Josiah started to reform. And we also realize that this Zephaniah may have some royalty attached to him. Because if you back up 4 generations in the introduction to Zephaniah, it points out that he is a son of, great-great-grandson of Hezekiah, who was a good king, a very good king. And so we get a little bit of information about when this takes place, and we get an idea about who he might be. Some said it could have been another Hezekiah, but that's chances that it's probably not. All right, now this is the problem going on in Jerusalem at the time. And the warning is given in verse 2, where God simply says, I'm getting rid of everything, sweeping it off the face of the earth. Verse 3, men and animals, birds of the air and fish of the sea. These are the people who are wicked and have only heaps of rubble. I will cut them off from the face of the earth. And so this is the warning of destruction. And he says, this is why Jerusalem and Judah are going to fall. With an outstretched hand in verse 4, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal, the name of the pagans and the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs and worship the starry hosts. So it's throwing in here the starry hosts. The astral deities of the Egyptians are being worshipped on the rooftops of the houses in Jerusalem. And those who bow down and swear by the Lord. syncretism is being practiced here. That's just a fancy word for saying they worship many gods. The people of Jerusalem at this time were worshiping Baal. They were worshiping the starry host, in other words, the gods from Egypt, and they were worshiping the God of Israel. All three of them are being worshiped. Got to cover your bases because you don't know which one's the real one. They're worshiping them all. And then there's this little conjecture at the very end, and they also worship those who swear by Molech. Do you see that at the very end of verse 5? Molech was one of those pagan gods that was responsible for child sacrifice. So we are told in this simple reference that yes, and even children are being sacrificed regularly at this time under these circumstances in Jerusalem. Now that shouldn't surprise us because we looked at all of those references to Ben Hidden and Topha, the references to their city dump where child sacrifices took place and how that dump was turned into a place, well, was turned into a dump simply because of the atrocities of sacrifice that took place in that valley. In other words, to stop the worship, that place became the dump. And that is where Jesus points out and says, this is what hell is like. You people in Jerusalem and Israel want to know what hell is like? It's like the city dump off of Jerusalem, filled with rotting, burning, dead carcasses, where the worm never stops gnawing and the flame never stops burning. You want to go to hell? That's where you're going to be, in a place like that. So we get that reference, and we got the child sacrifice, and all of this stuff ties together. Now, the theme that is in the book of Zephaniah could actually be summarized this way. The book talks about the day of the Lord. Now, it was in Amos that we first saw in the Old Testament a reference to the day of the Lord. When we looked at the book of Amos way back in Unit 31, I think it was, we noticed that what was the day of the Lord? The day of the Lord has different meanings at different times. When the children of Israel were living in apostasy from God and in sin, the day of the Lord was going to come to destroy them because of their sin. What we're going to see once the children of Israel have been taken into captivity and the nation destroyed, now the day of the Lord becomes the day when God is going to restore Israel to the land. The day of the Lord is a fluid concept in the Old Testament. It starts out by believing in the early part of the Old Testament that the day of the Lord is when God is going to make Israel a great nation and bring all the wealth of the world to Israel. Israel lives in this vast amount of sin, and God says, no, you got it wrong. The day of the Lord is going to be just the opposite. The day of the Lord is when I'm going to really sock it to you people and bring upon you destruction and disaster that you have never seen before, because you have not listened to me, you have not repented of your sins, and you have willingly gone and lived in the concept of paganism, worshiping the pagan gods on every hill and under every spreading tree, and worshiping the astro deities on the roofs of every home. 90% of the people worship Baal 90% of the time during this period of Israel's history. That's a phenomenal statistic. And God says, I'm going to destroy you. Not that he wanted to. He always gave warnings through the prophets. Destruction is coming. And every time there was destruction, there was always the word of what? But if you repent, I will hold back the destruction that is going to come upon you. That's what we have for the day of the Lord. Once Israel is destroyed, the day of the Lord becomes the restoration of Israel. And it's talked about in that sense. When we get to the time of Jesus, the day of the Lord is when the Messiah comes. And as we move on from that, the day of the Lord is when the Lord returns at the end of time. If you had to write a paper, You could write a paper on the day of the Lord by tracing its history and the nuances that it carries as it goes through time and how it changes. So if you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know where you are, and when you're talking about the day of the Lord, you're always going to be confused about, well, what is it right here? You have to know that. So anyways, right here is your first reference to the day of the Lord in chapter 7. The day of the Lord is near. I have written there, theme of the book, and I put a number 1 by it. Now, the reason I put theme... No, in verse 7. Did I say chapter 7?
Yeah.
Well, there's not 7 chapters. You should have known that right off the get-go. I was just testing to see if you actually did your readings. Obviously, a lot of you didn't. Okay, verse number 7. The day of the Lord is near. Theme of the book, it's the first reference in Zephaniah to that reference, the day of the Lord. And what's going to happen, and on that day of the Lord's sacrifice, I'm going to punish, in verse 8, the princes, the king's son. And then there's a reference to those clad in foreign clothes. That's the only reference that we have in the Old Testament that says anything like that. What it is saying is that at the time of before Josiah's reform, the people were dressing in foreign clothing. In other words, they were adopting not just the clothing issues, but the cultural issues, the religious issues. And the fact that they were dressed in their clothing says, well, we've cut our ties with Israel. We don't even dress like them anymore. And so there's this little reference. All those clad in foreign clothes. You better watch out. The princes are going to get it. The king's sons are going to get it. And you people who have stopped dressing the way you should be dressing, wearing foreign clothes, I'm going to get you. Verse 9. On that day, I will punish all who avoid stepping on the threshold. Reference. Anybody recall where we read about that? Where we studied that? Samuel 5, verse 5. Right? What happened in Samuel 5, verse 5? Remember when the Philistines conquered Israel in battle at, I think it was Gibeon, and they took the Ark of the Covenant with them back to Philistia? And every place it went, they had nothing but what? Problems. Problems. That thing kept being pushed around throughout Philistia because nobody wanted to have it. Every place it went, they had problems. They took it and they put it in the temple with the god Dagon. First night, Dagon falls over. The priest of Dagon come up the next morning and put Dagon back up. Next morning, they come in, and this time Dagon fell down again. But this time, his hands and his head were broken. Head was knocked off of the statue of Dagon. Hands were broken. Very simple message. Dagon is a dumb idol who has no brains and no power to do anything. No head, no hands. From that moment on, the worshipers of Dagon in Philistia never step on the threshold of the door, because that's where Dagon fell and broke. Okay, so then when you read this, I will punish those who avoid stepping on the threshold. That's what it's talking about there. And we looked at it, and I pointed it out, and we look at it again, because those two passages are tied together. All right. When we go down to verse 11, it's talking about the destruction that's going to come. And it says, first of all, it says, all of you people who live in the market district and all of you merchants, you're going to be wiped out. All who trade in silver and gold will be ruined. I think that if I was a conquering army, the first place I would go would be to the business district. That's where the wealth is being transferred. So if you happen to live in the market district, you're going to be in trouble. And then we get to verse 12. This is the verse that I told you is represented by this illustration up on the board right now. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like the wine left on its dregs. Now, the idea is that God is searching through the town looking for those who do not worship him, or at best are worshiping him and other gods, which is equivalently the same evil thing, maybe worse. And so the idea is that of a conquering soldier who, with sword in one hand, torch in another hand, looks for the booty. So too God is going to look for the deserters of those who have left him. Now, it also says about these people that God is looking for, the ones who are complacent, who think the Lord will do nothing, neither good or bad. What's going to happen to them? Their wealth will be plundered, their houses demolished. They will build houses but not live in them. They will plant vineyards but not drink the wine. Now, verse 14, again, theme, number 2. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. What's going to that be like? It's going to be a bitter day. Verse 15, a day of wrath. I'm just hitting key words in 15. Distress, anguish, trouble, ruin, darkness, gloom, clouds, blackness. Get in verse 16. A day of trumpet and battle cry. You did not want to hear a trumpet and battle cry because bad things are going to happen. But you're going to hear it now. And it's going to go against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. In the end of verse 17, God says, I will pour out their blood like dust and their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. On that day of the Lord's wrath, there's your theme, number 3. The whole world will be consumed and will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. Get in chapter 2, verse 2. On that day, there's number 4. See how it is? And in that same verse, I just called it 4. I didn't call it 4 and 5, but there is another reference that day, and later on it says the day of the Lord's wrath is coming upon you. So you can number them however you want. But again, it's another reference, and so now we would be up to 5 at the most. With that having been said, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And it now gives pronouncements of judgment and destruction upon the surrounding nations. Philistia. Remember, that is a nation where Dagon was worshipped. It is going to be destroyed as well. It has references into those who live by the sea. The Philistines were the seafaring people of the world at that time. They're the ones that had the navy. They probably came from Crete, where they became marine people by as far as reference to sailing. The Kerethites is the name that is listed for the people, but it's just the origin of those people that were in Crete. In verse 6, the land by the sea, references to that. Anyways, they're going to be destroyed. Go up to chapter 8. Moab and Ammon. Who are these two people? Remember Lot? Remember the daughters of Lot getting their father drunk? And on consecutive nights go and sleep with him while he's in his drunken stupor, and they become pregnant. One gives birth to Ammon, one gives birth to Moab. Those are Lot's children through incest with his 2 daughters. Nations that lived up to their name by being nothing more than drunken, bastardous, incestuous people. And what is Moab compared to here? Moab will become like Sodom, the Amorites like Gomorrah. And they will be a wasteland forever. Now, excuse me, the remnant of my people will plunder them, and the survivors of my nation will inherit their land. This is what they will get in return for their pride. Now, they would be Moab and Ammon. That's what they're going to get in return for their pride, for insulting and mocking the people of the Lord Almighty. Moving down to verse 12, it's a oracle against, says Cush, and that would be another reference to what we would refer to as Egypt. So just because that might be confusing, you could write Egypt in there. And then finally, the oracle against Assyria. As we move on, we get to chapter 3, and it talks about the future of Jerusalem. Now, we don't really get to the future of Jerusalem, to what we would call the future, until we get to 9. But the future of Jerusalem is this. It's going to start out with being destroyed. God is going to come, and he's going to totally devastate the nation. Woe to the city of oppressors, referring to Jerusalem, rebellious and defiled. She obeys no one. Jerusalem obeys no one. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to the Lord. Now, circle the names that are listed here about the people who are missing the point in who they should be worshiping. Their officials, that's the first word you circle, are roaring lions. In other words, they consume everything and leave nothing. So when it says their officials are roaring lions, yes, lions who eat everything and leave nothing. Their rulers are evening wolves. So put a circle around rulers who leave nothing for the morning. Their prophets, put a circle around prophets, are arrogant. They are treacherous men. Her priests, put a circle around priests, profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. Those are the officials and all of the people that are there. And they are going to be destroyed. At the end of verse 5, it says, they are rebellious and they are going to fall, and yet the unrighteous know not how to, do not know shame. We saw this in earlier references where it says, the believers do not even blush. They know no shame. So when we get down to verse 8, it's again, wait for me, declares the Lord. For the day I will stand up to testify, I have decided to assemble the nations and gather the kingdoms and pour out my wrath on them, my fierce anger. That again is the theme. What would this be? Number 6, where we have the day of the Lord. So that's the 6th reference to the day of the Lord in this short book. But we have the word that shifts the whole thought from what it was to something completely different. Then, in other words, after this has happened, after the day of the Lord, then I will purify the lips of the people, that they may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder. He's going to call the people from beyond Egypt. Worshipers who have been scattered are going to bring me offerings. Then we have, on that day, you will not be put to shame for the wrongdoings you have done. On that day, again, is a reference to the day of the Lord. So that would be what, number 7? And see, here we have the day of the Lord, but the entire concept has shifted from one of disaster to one of restoration. And we go on and we read how they're going to be. At the end of verse 11 in chapter 3, never again will you be haughty on my holy hill, but I will leave within you the meek and the humble, who trust in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong. They will speak no lies. Deceit will not be found in their mouth. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. And then we get this idea of joy. Look at the joy that is in here. Look at the happy words. And you want to circle them. Sing, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice. And look at the words. Sing, shout, glad, rejoice with all your heart. For the Lord has taken away your punishment and has turned back your enemy. The Lord is the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day they will say in Jerusalem, Do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hand go limp. Now, look at verse 17. 17 is one of those verses that is just absolutely beautiful. And what does it say? This is the description of how God feels about these people. Now, you have to understand, how bad were these people? How deserving were they of total destruction? How bad? Bad. How much destruction? Total destruction. But nonetheless, with all of that having been said, verse 17, the Lord your God is with you. Put a circle around with you. He is mighty to, put a circle around, to save. He will take great, put a circle around, delight in you. He will quiet you, put a circle around, quiet you with his love. And God will, put a circle around, rejoice with you. Now, if you ever want to know what your God is like, if you ever want to know what God thinks about you, okay, you ever wonder, what does God think about me? How does God feel about me? Well,
Love.
he's always, no, that's cutting it way too short. Take a look at the book, at the verse. He is with you. He will save you. He delights in you. Who do you delight in? He delights in you. You are his joy. He looks at you and he gets excited with happiness. He does this happy dance. There's Barbara, and he does a little circle dance, and, he delights in you. He will quiet you with his love. And he will rejoice over you. I don't know if anyone has ever rejoiced over any one of us. I mean, that would be really hard to come up with a time when somebody actually rejoiced over us. But God does. God rejoices over you. You put that verse in the context of what God thinks of you. And I wrote next to that, what does God think of you? And then I wrote, what a God. What a God. He's with you to save you. He delights in you. He quiets you. He rejoices over you with singing. He just can't keep it in. You see these little guys, these little prophets, these little short ones, they pack a wallop because you really get to know exactly what they're saying. This is a beautiful book. I don't care how you cut it. And it only took 3 chapters to do it in. I love it. And so do you. That's phenomenal. Zephaniah. Most people don't even know how to say it. They're so unfamiliar with it. But what a message it contains. Okay, we're going to go to... I remembered. I knew if I said I wouldn't, I would. Okay, I'll probably forget it next time. No, next time will be after the break. So anyways, we have the Assyrian king. Where was the Assyrian capital?
Nineveh.
Nineveh. Okay, what do we have here? We have the lion being destroyed. The lion of Assyria is being captured. Now, Nahum is right next to Zephaniah. You got to go back past, you go back past Habakkuk and you get to Nahum, right? Right, okay. So go back, pass over the 3 chapters in Habakkuk, because we're going to be looking at that. Get to Nahum now. Okay, 3 chapters.
1386.
What we have here then is the lion. Remember I told you Assyria was always referred to as a lion, and what she basically did was prowled over all of the land and dragged back to her den all of the booty, the plunder, the wealth of all of the nations. She was a big and a powerful nation. At this time, all of the other nations were weak. The nation that had any clout would have been Egypt, and they were far away. So Israel had the power of being this lion that had a huge, large territory that she could scour and devour. Thus, the lion. And we have Nahum. Nahum the prophet. All right, let's get to Nahum. If you haven't backed up, you've got to go by Habakkuk and get to Nahum. Nahum is a book which basically describes the destruction of Assyria. It is a book that reflects solely and exclusively upon Nineveh. It's Nineveh, Nineveh, Nineveh. The prophet is doing nothing but dealing with Nineveh. References to other things do not exist in this book. It's all about Nineveh. It's an oracle concerning Nineveh. It starts out by saying it very clearly, an oracle concerning Nineveh. And above Nineveh, you can write Assyria, just in case sometime you look at this years from now and you ask yourself, Nineveh, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about Assyria. So what is the Lord going to do? In verse 2, the Lord is zealous and avenging God. Verse 3. Now, here's the passage. Was it you, Dee, that said this passage to me? The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and he will not leave the guilty unpunished. Reference to what God is going to do to Nineveh. In verse 8, he will make an end of Nineveh. In verse 12, the last half of verse 12, although I have afflicted you, O Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break the yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. He's going to destroy Nineveh. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I'm in verse 14. I will destroy the carved images and cast idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of the one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. So, that's the pronouncement on Nineveh. Chapter 2 talks about the destruction of Nineveh. And at this, it says, the attacker advances against you, Nineveh. Guard your fortress, watch your roads, brace yourself, marshal all your strength. The Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob, like the splendor of Israel. Though destroyers have laid them waste and have ruined their lives. We get the destruction of the fall of Nineveh now. There is question about verse 3. Are these the Assyrian soldiers running around through the city with all of their power? Or would this be the Babylonian invading army that is being described? And the answer is, we don't know. I like to tell you which it is. It could read either way. But the point is that when we get to verse 5, the prophet says, he summons his picked troops, which definitely is Assyria. Yet they stumble on their way. So this whole idea about the chariots flashing and the spears ready and the chariots storming through the streets, I mean, does that all fall to pieces in verse 5, or is that the invading Babylonian army? Doesn't matter. It's a horse apiece. The end result is that they're all going to stumble along the way. The people who are going to take the city are going to pull tactical advantages on the city by, in verse 6, they're going to open the gates of the river that are going to flood through the city and destroy it. So obviously there was water that was being held back, that with the gates being opened up by the advancing army, floods through the city and destroys the city. It is decreed in verse 7 that the city will be exiled and carried away. Its slave girls moan like doves, and they beat their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool, and its waters draining away. I always think of as a kid, you had these little plastic pools, and you're having a great time in it, and somehow the side gets punctured, and you just watch the water just flood right out of the little tube. Well, that's what Nineveh is going to experience. Nineveh is like a pool, and its water is draining away. Stop, stop, they cry, but no one turns back. Look at how this reads. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. The supplies are endless. Yes, Assyria had taken all of the materials from the surrounding area and put it into her treasury. The supplies are endless, the wealth from all of its treasures. But she is pillaged, plundered, and stripped. Hearts melt away, knees give way, bodies tremble, and faces grow pale. You get the idea of extreme fear coming upon them. Now we get to this reference about the lion in our picture. Where now is the lion's den? It's asking, Assyria, where is all of that plunder from the other nations that you have carried off? Where is the lion's den? The place where you fed their young, where the lion and the lioness went, and the cubs with nothing to fear. The lion killed enough for his cubs and strangled the prey for his mate, filling the lair with the killings and his den with the prey. You get the image that is being used by the prophet here about the lion and the den. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will burn up your chariots in smoke, and the sword will devour your young lions. I will leave no prey on the earth. The voice of your messenger will no longer be heard. So that's the destruction. Chapter 3 gets into the woe about Nineveh. This is what's going to happen. Listen, to read this is to see this. This is written in such a way that is like vivid images in your mind. It's just phenomenal. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims, the crack of whips, the chatter of wheels, the galloping horses, the jolting chariots. You get the chariot and war horse, the charging cavalry, flashing swords, glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number. People stumble over the corpses, all because of the wanton lust of a harlot. In other words, the wanton lust of Assyria, of Nineveh, alluring, a mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution, a people by her witchcraft. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. And what is the Lord going to do? I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. A prostitute or an adulteress caught in the act would be humiliated by taking her and lifting her skirt over her face to allow everybody to look on her nakedness and shame her. A common practice. God is going to do that figuratively to Nineveh. And it's not only that. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. But verse 6, I will pelt you with filth. Well, I don't think that much could get worse than to have that done and then get pelted with filth. Great balls of dung. And I will treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. All who see you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is in ruin. Who will mourn for her? where can I find anyone to comfort you? Then it goes into verse 8. Nineveh, this is what you are getting, and the reason why you're getting it is I want to remind you what you did to Thebes. You slaughtered that city in 663, and you laid her totally to waste. And now that is a city in Egypt, obviously, and you are going to be destroyed. What you did to Thebes, I will do to you. What did she do in verse, I can't read over my writing, 10? Her infants were dashed to pieces at the head of every street. It was a common way of conquering a nation. You would just take the infants and kill them by smashing them into a rock or something. And it's a whole lot easier to kill an enemy child that you can grab by the feet and do that to than let that child grow up and 15 years have to fight for your life against that child. So that was a common practice. Not only did the people do that, but there's references that Israel actually did that too. She cast lots for her nobles, and all of her great men were put into chains. Kind of an interesting reference, because the Assyrians had a tendency to take their conquered victims and lead them away like a captured animal with a chain around their neck. There's a reference in writing where the Assyrian ruler took a captured leader from a country, put a dog chain around his neck, and put him in a crate, in a kennel, at the east gate of the city of Nineveh. And there he languished, like an animal in a cage, with a chain around his neck, because the Assyrian king was making a statement to anyone who entered into that city. What a nation. I'm preaching a sermon for midweek on Jonah. Jonah was a prophet that was sent to what country? What city? Nineveh. Very good. You did good on that. He was sent to Nineveh. Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. I wonder why. Well, you'll get more of it in the sermon. But the Assyrians were horrible. If they conquered a city, when they went into a city with battle, anyone that was left in the city, they would impale. All right? And those who were dead, they would sever their heads, and they would take the heads of the victims of that city and make them into pillars. The Assyrian kings even went so far as severing the heads of other kings and wearing it around their neck. They were the most brutal nation ever as far as how they treated conquered victims. And that's not to mention the fact that they would skin their victims alive and take the skin back and put it on their palace walls as decorations and yada, yada, yada. So that was really, you understand, nobody liked the Syrians. This book is a book of absolute delight and joy to everybody, because to see this nation go down is to see one of the greatest things that could ever possibly happen for the well-being of society. And it closes with 3 references to locusts. And it starts in verse 15, and it says that there the fire will devour you, the sword will cut you down, and like grasshoppers, consume you. So the image is that these people are going to be destroyed as like when grasshoppers or locusts come in and eat a crop. And they are going to multiply like locusts. You are going to increase the number of your merchants till you have more, till they have more than the stars of the sky. But like locusts, they will strip the land and then fly away. The whole realm of being like locusts in verse 17, they're going to be like locusts on a warm day, that's on a cold day that settles on a wall, and as soon as the day warms up, they're gone and are going to disappear. your officials will have fled away, and they will be no more. They will no longer exist. O king of Assyria, in verse 18, your shepherds slumber. Shepherds are the leaders. Your nobles lie down to die. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal your wound. Your injury is fatal. And this summarizes it all. Everyone who hears the news about you will clap their hands at your fall. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? The city of Nineveh fell in the year 612 BC. Turn in your workbooks. Page 81. Bottom of the page, in bold print. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest this little fact. Nineveh was so thoroughly and utterly destroyed in 612 BC that what was left of it laid undisturbed for approximately 2,450 years until unearthed by archaeologists in 1843. When God says, I'm going to destroy that city, I guess he did. Can you imagine a city the size of Nineveh? It's a huge city. It took Jonah 3 days to walk through it. Okay? A huge city. It says that Jonah went and preached, repent, or you're going to face the Lord's wrath. And it says that it took him 3 days to walk through the city and proclaim that. That was a huge city. That was a city who, during its day, had all of the wealth of this entire region that was there to build her up. And when God destroyed her, it took over 2,400 years before an archaeologist stumbled upon its ruins. Now, here's the thing that you have to question about Nahum. Nahum simply states that fact and says no more. Here's the question. Why wouldn't Nahum have closed this by saying, and Judah, if you don't repent, you're going to be destroyed like this. For whatever reason, Nahum doesn't say that, and you have to ask yourself, why didn't he? And the answer is, we don't know. The only thing that we can come up with is this. He is so happy that the city is destroyed that his joy thinks of nothing but the happiness of that nation no longer living in existence. That's Nahum. And that's what the Lord did to those people. It is time for a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to close with Habakkuk.